Welcome everyone to another CTC Software webinar. My name is Sean Zerbis, the Director of BIM Development here at CTC Software. And in today's session, we're going to continue the HIVE CMS Admin Learning Series, focusing on the step of processing into HIVE any kind of Revit content. We're going to go over as many details as possible and also talk about some strategies for future management as well. Of course, these webinars are all recorded and will be processed up to our YouTube channel and into the HIVE CMS Admin Learning playlist as soon as it's ready, which likely will be tomorrow. You'll be notified of that. Also, as always, I keep an eye on the questions window. So if you have questions while I'm talking about a topic, you want extra clarification on it, please start in the questions window. And I, of course, will save a huge section at the end for questions and answers. If there's a lot of questions, we'll hang out and answer those. But I try to answer them in line as well, as much as possible. So with that, let's jump in and talk about what we're going to be kind of covering today. So adding content into HIVE, into the HIVE CMS, is really the major last step in preparing the CMS before you really get all your users invited, and so that they can begin searching for content. But you have to have content there for them to search, right? And that's why this is the last step. Most files are really easy to add into HIVE, and even a lot of Revit content is pretty easy to add into HIVE, but there's some nuances that I want to make sure we explain so you know exactly what needs to happen with Revit content, both normal loadable families and system families. And so we're going to talk about both of those really in depth on how to load both from Revit Projects. And also, as I mentioned, we're going to talk about some strategies and some specifics that you're going to want to consider while you're working with this content. Okay, we're going to go over 4 major topics here. We're going to describe the different kinds of Revit content types just to make sure that we're all on the same page. Many of you probably already know this, but I want to make sure we review it just in case you're slightly new to this and some of the terms I might be using. We're going to be processing component families into the HIVE CMS and taking a look at the steps that are involved for that. I'll process one in today. We're also going to process in project hosted content into the HIVE CMS and talk about how that's different than normal component families and answer some questions that I get very frequently about exactly that topic. And then at the very end, we're going to talk about establishing a plan to continually maintain your content as time goes on for updating and maintaining your content that's already processed into HIVE, so you know exactly what those steps are and some things you're going to want to consider when you're uploading your content for your own sanity in future management. Since I'm not big on death by PowerPoint, we're pretty much going to jump in live almost immediately. But first, we're going to talk about some different content types. In fact, you know what? Let's do this live as well. Inside of Revit directly. So we're going to kind of preclude HIVE here, or kind of preview before this. In Revit directly, there's kind of 2 major sections that we have here on the splash page, the opening page that shows up for many of us when we first open up Revit itself. I happen to be in 2020. It's similar for pretty much all versions. When you're on this splash page, you'll notice 2 major sections. There's a models section and there's a families section. You'll also notice when you go to the open command that there are a number of different file types. The most important ones that we look at most frequently is RVTs as a project model and RFAs as family content. Now, there's some terminology that I'm going to use here today. You saw sort of on my previous slide here the concept of processing what we call component families and processing project hosted content. I'm actually going to use the term here component families or loadable families interchangeably. They are the same thing. Component families and loadable content is basically anything that is a .rfa. That's component loadable families. You process the file directly. The other kind of content is project hosted content, and you'll also hear me use the term system families. System families is content that exists directly in a project model of some form and can only exist in a project model in some form. These are things you can't save out as a .rfa. An example of that would be a wall type or a floor type or a duct type. Those types of objects can only exist in the boundary of the project. Now, there might be components that are associated to those things, like on a wall, you might have a wall sweep. That wall sweep might be made up of a profile. That profile would be an RFA. But the wall type itself, the main wall type definition, that is a system family. The profile that defines the wall sweep, if you have one of those, would be a component family. Similarly, ductwork is a system family. The fittings that you use in a duct system, like elbows and T's and transitions, those are component families because those are RFAs that you can load in. The duct system itself, that's a system family. And so we're using those major delineations because as we're going through the process of loading different content types, normal files and families, loadable families and component families, those can be loaded directly from the file, whereas project hosted content or system families have to be loaded in a different way. And we're going to take a look at both of those today. First of all, let's take a look at how you process component families and the options you need to add that to the processing window and what that step all looks like, what you need to have all in place. So to do this, processing component families here, I'm going to go ahead and be in the HIVE CMS itself. I have that open. I am signed in right now as an admin, so I have access to the Add Content button. If you are a org admin, a CMS admin, or a manager of the library, you should have that Add Content button, and you'll be able to choose whatever library it is you want to add your content to. Now, if you're a CMS admin or an org admin, you'll have a list of all the libraries. If you're a library manager, you'll have just the libraries to which you've been assigned that manager level right, okay? So I'm going to choose a library here. You have to choose one library before you can process anything. The process button won't even light up if you don't have a library chosen. So I'm going to go ahead and choose a library here, and then I'm going to add a bunch of content here to the HIVE CMS window. To add content to this window, you have three options when you're talking about files, normal files. You can add files directly, which will let you browse around and find files on your system using the standard Windows file browser. That's option one. Option two is you can add an entire folder and it will scan for all the files in that folder by simply browsing to a folder someplace on your system. That's another option. But the way that I personally tend to add content into the HIVE CMS for the purpose of processing is I open up Windows Explorer, and where did it go? It's hiding back here someplace. There we go. I use the Windows Explorer window here and browse to wherever it is I want to add content from, and I grab that content. Like maybe I go into a Sitescapes folder here and I grab a specific family. I can drag and drop that family into the Add Content window here, and it will add it directly. It'll tell you things like what version of Revit that particular file comes from. It'll show you the current preview from that particular file, whatever's stored on it if you were looking at large icons. That's what's going to show up inside of here. So that's one option. You can add it file by file by file if you want to. So I could go to another folder here, find another family or two, and drag and drop them into here if I want. Alternatively, and what I prefer to do is if I'm going to take an entire directory of content, even if it has subdirectories, I might go to that top level here like my Sitescapes manufacturer folder, and I might drop the entire thing over here to the right. Now, it's going to take it a second to scan all the files inside of there, but it's going to add all of them in one big step. A thing to notice here is that some of these things that it's going to add, like this one, if I was to expand this just to actually, let's make the whole window a little bit wider here, you'll notice that this is a .png file. There's a couple of those. There's an Excel file that's a part of some of these folders. These are things that I probably do not want to process into HIVE right now. Even though in today's session, I'm focusing exclusively on Revit content, there are many other file types that you can actually add into the HIVE space for convenience purposes. In this example right here, though, I really don't want these PNGs and these Excel files and potentially some other things like log files that may have made their way into my directories. So I'm going to be very intentional about sorting this by the file extension, and I'm going to go find all those things that I don't want. Like these ones right here, the log, the PNG, I don't want those. Intentionally, I'm going to remove them from my list. There's probably a few more down below here. Yep, look at this. A whole bunch of Excel files made their way in because those are valid files that I can process into HIVE. So I'm going to go ahead and remove all of those and leave behind just the RFAs that I really want. These are the Revit family files that are component families that I want to bring in. Oh, look at that. There's a bunch of JPEGs as well. Let's clean these up. Remove those from my list. So those are the ones I'm going to remove. There's 25 distinct Revit families here in the list, and I'm good to go. By the way, just so you know, in case you're wondering, you can also throw your PDF standards inside of here if you want from your network. I would put them into a different directory like my standards and procedures, but you can process in your standards. You can process in documents and templates, and whatever you need can be put into Hive. Again, today's focus is about Revit families because they need special handling. Now, in this case, when I'm processing normal RFAs, Revit family files, loadable content, component families, whatever you want to call it, the version here is going to be listed. It tells me what version the file was last saved in. When you're processing RFAs, you need to make sure that whatever design app you're using is at least equal to that version, but you can easily be ahead of it. You can be a newer version than the family files, and that's not a problem at all. Because when you process it, what's going to happen is this will use your active Revit session, and you do have to have a session of Revit open to process Revit content. It will open that family. It will do an upgrade of the family. That's okay. It's going to scan it. It's going to generate a preview if you have that option set in your organization settings. And then after it generates that preview, it's going to close the family without saving it. It's going to upload the original file if you have your upload option turned on, also in your organization settings. It will publish the preview that it's generated, and it will publish the metadata for the purpose of searchability. So I can actually search for and find this very easily. It does all of that family by family by family by family for every single one of these. It will do that step. And that's fantastic because what you'll do is you'll click process and you're going to walk away. You're going to let it run. While it's processing, it's going to continually try to activate Revit and do things inside of Revit. So you don't want to be trying to draw while this is happening because it's going to mess with you trying to draw. I typically will do this process when I have a number of families on a separate computer next to me and I keep an eye on it, or a virtual machine and I keep an eye on it, or I let it rip overnight and I go home, and then when I come back in the morning, I get a report of what happened. So let's give an example of what this is going to look like. I want to actually process some content in front of you today. So I'm going to remove a number of these items so we don't have to wait for a very long time, because each one of these will tend to take between 15 and 30 seconds per family, depending on how big it is. These are pretty small. Well, this one's kind of big, 5 meg for this particular family. Maybe I'll remove that one. I don't want to wait for that one to upgrade. It might take a little longer. Let's use just this one family here from 2018. I'm going to click process, and what this will do is leverage my background Revit 2020 session. It's going to process directly into this library, and we're going to let that rip for a minute. So this is actually activating Revit like I told you it would. It's going to run that upgrade. It's going to generate a preview for the family. It won't actually show me the family necessarily, but it's going to generate a preview for the family. And then close it without saving and then upload the original. Now, in this case, it didn't take 15 seconds. I think it was more like 5 to 10 seconds, and that's fantastic. But it tells me here that this particular family was successful. And for every single family that you had in the list, it will tell you if it was successful or not. If it was unsuccessful for some reason, typically it will tell you why. And if it was unsuccessful, if there was an error that related to a family, it will not remove it from the list here. It will keep it in the list. So you could potentially reprocess it in a future step. And that way it saves you the need to worry about this. You can just let it run overnight. And if there's 5 errors for some reason, there's families that maybe are corrupted or something's wrong with them, whatever, they may error. And if they do, when you come in the next morning, you can simply just either reprocess that directly if you knew about those errors. If it was benign errors that maybe your computer was running out of memory or something, right? That happens sometimes. Revit is a memory pig, and sometimes it just doesn't process super efficiently, and sometimes it takes a while, and maybe that tells Hive, I can't do this right now, and so it'll skip it and go on to the next family if your computer's out of RAM. In this case, it was successful, and that's great. But that's all there really is to processing Revit's family files. It's really easy. It's just like processing any file. Throw PDFs in here, click process once you pick your correct library, and it will scan those files and their metadata and upload them, and you're done. You throw a bunch of things in. So that's great. All right. I did see a question show up about updating content in the future, and I'm going to get to that question a little bit later when we talk about updating content. So I'm not going to ignore it. I just want to make sure that you know that I'm going to answer that a little bit later on about processing updated content as well. Let's talk next, though, about adding Revit project elements. This is a little different, right? This is the system family content. So let me jump back to my PowerPoint real quick here. We just finished talking about processing component families, the core processing of that. Let's now jump into processing system families. This is that project hosted content, the wall types, the floor types, duct types, schedules, typical details, model groups, things like that that exist within the boundary pretty much of a project. How do we process that? Well, to do that, instead of adding the project to here and processing the entire model, which is what I hear a lot of people do a lot of the time, they throw the model in and then they expect to be able to pull the things out of it. And I can understand why that might be, but I want to tell you today, that's not how it works. What it does is that if you process the model, if I was to go find, let me pull this window back across here. If I was to go find on my computer where I have my warehouse file or my container file that hosts all my content here, let's see, Revit settings, Hive, the A20 warehouse file, right? If I throw this over here, it's going to add it and it's going to treat it like it's a starter project. When a user double clicks on this, it's going to open that project detached if it's work shared and let them begin to work with that model directly. It doesn't pull any content out if you add it as a file like we did with our Revit families, okay? Instead, what you do is you open this model. You open it in your active Revit session in the correct Revit version. If you remember before, I told you it doesn't matter what Revit version you're in when you're processing Revit families. Doesn't matter at all. It'll upgrade it and it'll close the file without saving and it just does whatever. But when you're processing specifically project hosted content, especially if you're uploading that content, it's really important that you process it from the correct version of Revit. So I'm going to open up this A20 warehouse right here, copy my path real quick, and in Revit, I'm going to do a file open. We'll browse to where that is, and I'm going to open up my A20 warehouse. Now, I want to point out something very specific here. This is going to save you BIM managers and Hive managers a bit of a headache in the future. I strongly recommend when you're processing this, if this is a shared model, a work sharing enabled project, that you do not create a new local copy. Open the central directly. Don't open it detached. Open it directly. You won't be making any changes. You're going to be closing it without saving anything. All we're doing here is opening the model to process content out of it. So this is safe as long as you don't make any changes. I'm going to go ahead and open up all work sets here and just open up that project model. I'm opening it up because the model that's open, the path of that model, where it is right now, is what Hive stores for its path. So if you open up a local copy and it's behind your C username, that's the, C users, Sean Z, whatever, it opens it up in that location, probably in your My Documents folder by default. That's going to be a problem in the future when you go to update content and understand if there's changes, because that file may not exist on your system and it certainly won't exist on anybody else's system. So do yourself a favor, open the central model directly, don't open a local copy. Again, we're not making any changes here. Then when you jump into Hive over here, what you're going to do, it's going to know that you've got that model open. In fact, mine isn't refreshed here, but it's going to know that there it is. It's this guy right here. It knows I'm in the drafting view of that A20 warehouse file. But I'm going to go ahead and just add Revit project elements, and it will use whatever this background model is right here. It's going to scan this model, and I should have pinned Hive to the foreground, which I forgot to do. I always forget to do that. Typically, yeah, because it's going to keep activating Revit until it's done. But it's going to scan this model back here for all the system families, all the schedules, all the drafting views and the typical sheets, all the materials, all the fill patterns, line styles, all the things that Hive can actually add directly from a warehouse project file or a container project file. I think it's done now. There we go. Normally I would pin Hive to the foreground so I don't have it continually activate back there if I have Hive in the same window as my Revit session. But this is going to give me a list of all of the things that I can possibly add into Hive from that warehouse file. Now here's a trick. I typically sort by category to give me all the items all together. Otherwise, it probably is going to do it by name or by the order in which it finds it. So we're going to go ahead and just sort this by category to save me a bunch of scrolling around to find some things. Okay. With this, you can filter items here if you want to as well. Like I can type in schedules and it'll show me just schedules if I want to try and filter this down. I do that a lot to save me, again, a bunch of scrolling around. Maybe I just want walls, like walls here. I can type that in and it'll find me just things that have the word walls. In this case, some materials, in this case, some view templates that are for that, but also walls basic, a whole bunch of basic walls and stacked walls here in my list. So it just gives me a slightly shorter list to go through. And all I have to do then is select all of the items that I want to add to this background window and simply check the selected items. And then I can search for something else, floors. And then it'll find me some floors and I can check that one item if that's what I wanted as well. And maybe I want, I don't know, views, see what shows up here. Yeah, there's a couple of views here that are drafting views. Or there's some view templates here. If I was to back this up and say maybe view templates, it'll give me just my view templates that exist in Hive so I can transfer them from one project to the other. Maybe I want things like fill patterns. I can type in the word fill and it'll give me fill patterns for drafting patterns and for model patterns and filled regions and all these things that I might want to use. I can select those, check the selected, and ultimately when I'm all done, if I back that out here and I go to my selected list, I should see a whole bunch of selected items. Maybe it's not going to filter by that, but I can add those elements to my project here and it's going to show me a list of all of the things that it's going to be adding in that I've just selected. So it gives me a real easy ability here to source all of my system content, my project hosted content from a single project model, which means my management of that model is far easier as well when it all comes out of that single model. Now, the processing of this content, that system family content, project hosted content, is a little different than the actual normal file processing that happens. When you process project elements, and if you're setting in the Hive systems, let me show the setting here. If I go into the Hive portal into CMS, settings, organization, if you're leveraging the cloud content caching right here, if this is checked, and I recommend you do have this checked if you can, turn that on. What this will do is as Hive processes content, it uploads the family or the system family directly into the Hive cloud, as well as the preview, as well as the data, okay, that to make it searchable. With this, what it does is it looks at this A20 warehouse file, and instead of uploading the entirety of that file, however big it is, it actually pulls out that one wall type and stores it in a micro file, a much smaller file, which makes it so fast for BIM for end users to actually consume that content in their project. Because if I have like a 500 meg warehouse file, which is very common, if I have a 500 meg warehouse file, I don't want to have the user's machine cache a 500 meg model to pull one wall type in, or one duct type, or one typical detail. That's too much time to waste. So instead, what Hive does is it creates a micro file of just this wall or just this wall in a little isolated file. And when it pulls that into the user's active drawing, it caches this super tiny, like less than meg file, and then drops that into their active design session. So Hive is super fast when it can do that, right? So, but when it's doing that, Hive or Revit in the background is actually creating that file using your active Revit version. So I mentioned earlier, open your warehouse file in the correct version of Revit, because Hive is going to leverage your active Revit session to make that file and then upload that crafted file. It still stores the original path to the original warehouse, but it uses its own little micro file special management of this to make it super efficient for end users. All right. That's really important. Now, I'm not going to process all of this. In fact, I'm going to remove everything. I'm going to reprocess this and add just a couple of items so you can see this happen live. I'm going to pin Hive to the foreground this time and not make the same mistake I made last time. So when I click Add Revit Project Elements, it's going to leave Hive in the foreground. Hive cannot go to the background, even though it's accessing Revit back here and scanning that project. It's going to keep Hive on top. So I'll know exactly when it's done. I do that all the time, and I recommend you do that as well. I like having Hive pinned on top of everything, especially when I'm doing processing like this as a BIM manager. Okay, it's going to take probably just a second more. The bigger your warehouse file is, the longer this takes to process this content in. That's okay. The end user who's going to be consuming this content that you're investing your time in right now, they never have to wait for any of this because you've already spent the time to process it in. Okay. So with this, the Revit project elements, let's just add a couple of things. Like I want to add, I'm going to add a fill pattern, just something, I don't know, we'll do like, I don't know, let's see, what do we have here? We'll do a block 8 by 16. We'll add this. Maybe I want to do a schedule. I think I have some schedules inside of here. So maybe I'll do like my door schedule. Do I have one of those? Door frame schedule here. I'm going to add this in. And maybe I will do a view template. Maybe I want to do something like I have a typical floor plan general view template that I like to use, like my general floor plan view template, my finished plan view template. All right. Now, these don't have any pretty graphics to show. There's no preview for these, and that's okay. It's just going to show a box, but it has the name, and you can always make it pretty if you really want to with a post-applied image. But I'm going to add these 4 items to the list. They're going to get processed into my Revit Content CTC Express Tools library, just like my other content. I'm going to click Process, and this is going to do pretty much the exact same thing it did for the Revit family, except for now, it is generating a file for each one of these because these are coming out of a Revit project element. And in this case, you can see that pattern that took a few seconds to do. Doesn't take very long at all. All 4 of these will probably be done in about 15 seconds, give or take. Yeah, there's the second one. So this happens really quickly. So while this is happening, there are some questions that I saw pop in, and I'm going to go ahead and answer a couple of these live while this is processing here. So there was 2 questions that I saw about templates. Can you put templates into the Hive CMS? The answer is absolutely. You process them just like you would a normal Revit family. You just add your template file to the list. In fact, I'll show you that. Here's 4 success messages. All of my content processed in. It's all happy. We're good to go. So I'm done. And those content, all 4 of them now are available in my Revit Content CTCE library, sourced out of my A20 warehouse file, and Hive knows that. Let's actually process a template in. I'm going to process in 2 different files, I think, here, if I can get them both. If I pull up my window here, oh, you know what? I have to have Hive not stay in the foreground now because I'm presenting off a single monitor. One of the files that I often use for templates is a starter project, an RVT file. This is an empty Revit project file that has work sharing enabled. That's something you cannot do in a normal RTE, Revit template file. But I can take this RVT starter project and simply throw it over here, and it's going to be an actual piece of content. The whole RVT is added up. I'm not adding content out of it. I am adding it directly as content. So that's one way. The other file type here, I thought maybe I had some RTEs here in the list. It doesn't look like I do. Let's see, if I wanted to find out where templates were, let's just file, open, nope, new, project. I don't even know where my templates are stored here. Browse to wherever this happens to be. Actually, let's do my mechanical default template. Shift right click, cool tip here. You can copy as path, and it will copy the path, the entire path of this file. And I use that sometimes when I want to browse in Windows Explorer up here. I can simply paste that and then strip off the actual file because I'm not trying to open it. I'm just trying to get to the path here. And then I can find there's the RTEs at my fingertips. So if I want to add that into Hive, pin it to the foreground. No, let's not do that. Let's simply grab a couple of these like mechanical, electrical, plumbing, drag and drop. There's my RTEs. They're the actual content. And again, I just click process and let it process it. I'm not going to do it right now because I don't want to wait for these files to be processed and uploaded. It might take probably that, I don't know, maybe 30 seconds a piece given the file size. Maybe it'll be less, I don't know, but I'm not gonna wait for it. Same thing though, process and I'd let it go. However, I would process these not into my normal content directory, but if you take a look at when we were talking about library setup in one of the previous webinars, I would put this in my templates directory. This is where my templates go. These are project templates. I would process them into that templates area there. And then when you want to start a brand new project, we took a look at how this works when we were using content. I have a pre-save search that finds me all of my templates. That's Revit content that I can work with right here. And you simply double click on it. Here's my actual starter project that I use very regularly to start a brand new project. You simply double click. It's going to go ahead and it's going to detach from central, preserve my work sets in this case, or I could discard work sets if I really wanted to. I don't usually do that. It jumps over here into Revit, and it'll probably pop up my work set dialog here to ask me what I want to open. And then I'm in an actual template, like I'm in a brand new project that's unsaved. And when I click save, it asks me over here, where do I want to save it? And I'm starting a brand new project directly out of HIVE CMS. So my templates can be in HIVE. All of my normal loadable family content can be in HIVE, my system families, my view templates, my schedules, my typical sheets, like everything that you have that's Revit focused should pretty much be in HIVE. All of your materials should be in HIVE, everything, so that your users know they have a one-stop shop for all of their content. That's the whole purpose here of the HIVE product, okay? All right, we've now talked about processing system families, and we kind of reviewed a bit about component families or regular Revit files. That includes templates. You process them just like you would component families. The system families are processed using that special workflow that we just talked about. And now let's talk about some of the considerations for updating content. I get asked a lot, and I saw some questions show up in the questions window about how do you update content? Does HIVE automatically do that on your behalf? What is the process to update? What happens if there's an issue? Like, what's all this happening with updating of stuff, right? So let's take a look at how that works, because updating content and maintaining this over time is really important as well. All right. Let's take a look at one thing that I just processed. What was it here? Add content. I forgot what it was. It was a fill pattern. Let's craft a search here and find that fill pattern that I just did. I think it was the 8x16 block drafting pattern that I put into this library, and I believe it is a fill pattern. Must have been a model pattern, I guess, because I don't have any drafting patterns in my list. Drafting. Nope, no drafting patterns. Okay, so I'm just going to go ahead and use that. I'm going to apply and see what shows up. Hey, look at, there it is, block 8x16. So this is the pattern that I just added today. In fact, we can confirm that if I select this. We go over into the details over here. Content properties says it was added by me today, 1/11/23 at 12/27, which was effectively when I added it. So if this pattern changes in the future, how do I update it? How do I get it to reprocess again and get the latest and greatest version? I'm not going to make any changes to it today, but I am going to go ahead and reprocess this content and show you exactly how that works. Okay? How do I update it? How do I update anything in HIVE? Everything that you update in HIVE is exactly the same thing. You simply go back to the Add Content window and you reprocess the exact same thing again. And what HIVE will do is replace the one that's there if it already exists. And if it doesn't already exist, it'll make a new entry. So your process is the same. In this case, pin HIVE to the foreground, add Revit project elements, because that's where this came from, out of the, oh, I bet you I have the wrong file active. I do. I have my template active and it's not going to know what to do. Let me cancel this. Let's activate the correct project model here instead. No, it's still thinking. We'll have to let it think for a minute because I told it to grab that. Here we go. Now I can get it. All right. Add Revit project elements from the correct warehouse file. That's what I wanted to have active, was my warehouse file. not my completely detached starter project. So we're going to go ahead and let this thing scan the project. I'm going to re-find that 8x16. If I made a change to it, I probably would have just made a change, know that I'm done, and I would simply reprocess it in and be ready to go. And now I'm doing this in Revit 2020, but let's say I had upgraded my model and I've made some changes that were version specific, say for Revit 2023 or Revit 2022 or whatever. Well, I would do the same thing. I would open up, I would migrate forward, I would open up and save the content that project and do whatever custom stuff that needs to be done for Revit 2022 or 23, add the new features, add some cool new whatever that's going to take advantage of the new Revit functionality, and then I would simply reprocess my content back in again. So let's do 8x16, find that block, add my element. I'm just going to process the one here, click process, and it's going to rip through and update that piece of content, and it's going to keep it, in this case, in the version 2020. I will show you in a minute here what happens when I do have multiple versions of the same thing from multiple version years, and I'll explain what that does for end users as well. So here's a successful update. It reprocessed, it re-added it back in. I was the user who did it, and if we jump back over here and we sort of re-fetch this information, you'll notice that it was originally added by me at this time and date, and now it was just recently updated by me at this time, on the same date in this case, but this time, so 10 minutes later. So I just reprocessed the same thing and it has an update. Well, what happens if there's multiple versions of the same thing? Well, let me clear all my searches out here and let me run a search for CTC's walls. Walls are a system family. And with these walls here, if I grab one of these, I think this one perhaps, yeah, notice how I had some original content from Revit 2018? That wall was processed in a while ago, and then I recently reprocessed this back in 2021 in the 2020 version. What you'll notice is that, just like with all Revit families, component families and system families and schedules and sheets and all of those items, when there's multiple version years of the same content, the user is presented with just one entry. They go search for walls, they find all the walls that they can use, that they can consume. And in this case, this wall has 2 version years. Well, that's totally fine. When I grab it and use it, it'll just use the one that's closest to my current Revit version year, which in this case is the 2020 version, and I'm off and running. As an end user, it's completely transparent to me. So if we were to jump into this project over here, if I go to a floor plan and I start drawing walls, WA command here, draw some walls, you'll notice from my AutoCAD type selector here hiding behind Revit, or hiding behind Hive, that I only have some generic elements in my project. But let's just say I wanted to use this wall specifically. If I double click on this wall, it's going to go ahead and draw that wall into my active project. It's going to load it, the correct version, in this case, the 2020 version, and I'm drawing that wall now. It's loaded just the one that I asked for from 2020, and I'm off and running. I'm just drawing. So this is super fast, right? If I was in 2019 drawing, it would actually pull me the 2018 version of that wall because I don't have a 2019 edition actually loaded into here. But the end user is not even going to notice. They're just going to grab the wall and go, and it's going to load it into their project just like this did, and they're going to be off and running. Okay? Another strategy, let's talk about some more update process. I was talking about the process here of just reprocessing something, adding a Revit project element back in here because you knew there was a change, or adding specific files back in here because you know you just finished making some changes to it and you know that it's good, you've tested it, and you now want to release it. You process that in intentionally. Hopefully this answers the question from earlier. If you make changes to files on your network, Hive doesn't just automatically grab that and add it in. That would actually not necessarily be the best thing. Why? Well, if you're halfway through editing it and a user comes over and knocks on your door and says, hey, Bob, I need help doing this thing, and then you save and you walk away, because of course you're going to save, that's the right thing to do, you walk away. If Hive recognized that that file was just saved and it automatically processed it in, Murphy's Law states that exactly at that moment, half of your office is going to grab that now half-finished piece of broken content that isn't ready yet, and they're going to start using it, and then you're going to get just a flood of support questions as to why this thing isn't working right? So Hive doesn't process anything until you explicitly say, this is ready for release. Maybe you're in the middle of updating a door or an air terminal, you finish editing it, you've tested it, then you throw it into Hive and you process that very intentionally. And if it's already there, it just replaces it and you're good to go, right? But there's times when maybe you are part of a full team who's making changes. It's a whole team of people. You're all making changes, and you don't necessarily know all of what's been done, and maybe you want to find out if everything is up to date. Well, there's a process here where you can use the export content. What this does is asks the Hive system for an Excel file of everything that's in this particular library. It's a list of every piece of content that's here, every file, every date that it was last updated. You can export that out. Now, I've already done this because I didn't want to wait the 4 minutes for it to actually come through. It sends me a file that looks like this. Let me unpin Hive from the foreground. Sends me a file that looks like this right here. It's a whole bunch of GUIDs, GUIDs, for the content ID and the content file IDs. It's a list of the names of the files over here. It tells you the Revit category, the Revit version it was processed from, if there's any tags associated to it, what the file format is for it, the file path that it was last discovered at, all kinds of stuff here. Who was the last person to update it, who last added, or who first added it, when was it last modified, all kinds of stuff. It even gives you some things about average ratings of content from end users. All kinds of data here. When it was last used by somebody, right? All kinds of information. But the reason for this file, the real reason for it, is that with this file, once you have it, you can turn right back around and you can use this in Hive over here to update all the content or get a list of content that's been updated. Now, I'm not going to officially click on this because it takes a little bit. I've got thousands of files inside of there, and I don't want it to go update every one of them. But all I do is I browse for that particular file that went by default to my downloads folder, and I would click open. And what it's going to do, file by file, is scan every file at every path and say, is the date modified of the file on my local environment newer than the file that Hive knew about when it was last processed up? And if it's newer, what it will do is it will add it to the Hive processing window back here and get it ready to be reprocessed for you. Or in the case of project files, when it has to actually open the actual RVT project file, what it will do here is it will update the status column to possibly updated, because it doesn't know if the wall was updated. It knows that the file was changed, and so it'll let you know that that file is newer, and you might want to consider reprocessing some of the content out of it. But for all of the RFAs, if they're actually newer, it will say updated, and it will add it to the list. That's what it's going to do. Then you can actually look at the status column here for all the content and know if there's steps that you need to take manually for some reason. Maybe you don't know if a certain thing is done yet, but it says the file date's newer. Maybe you need to go manually check that file. Well, you can use the filtration inside of here once it's been populated to actually understand, like, give me all the things that are updated or maybe updated, or things that were moved or it can't find them for some reason. Let me talk about that. One of the things that I wanted to talk about in this updating content is a strategy that you need to be careful about. You need to be consistent with. Remember when I mentioned about not opening up your warehouse file as a local copy because it puts it behind your desktop, your username? If I go over here to the file paths, I want to point something out to you here. In these file paths, if I drop this list down, you'll be able to see just a quick summary of all the file paths that are available. I can make this a little bigger. Excel's really cool about showing you this. Every single different file path that's in the system here. And as I scroll down, you'll notice a bunch of these behind C users. C users Chris, C users Dave, L, Dave M, Sean Z, me. That's my computer right here. There might be some variants of this actually in the list here, but there's a lot of different file paths. Clearly, I am not practicing what I'm about to tell you right now. Don't do this. Don't add stuff from your desktop. Don't do that, because in the future, when somebody else, one of your team members, wants to go ahead and process content and they go get this list and try and update it, it's going to tell them that all these files are deleted, that it doesn't know where they came from, because it came from your desktop, not their desktop. So you should be practicing good workflows here and always storing your content in some centralized location. Like in my case, I've got an H drive where I've got all kinds of content stored, or an O drive for some of my MEP content, some network location here that isn't personal to me, so that I can do this process and my whole team can do this process as well. And it makes it really easy then to maintain this. Now, if you do find some files are stored behind the C drive, and I was just talking to a company the other day who had a whole bunch of files stored behind usernames from different offices. They now know that they need to go through and reprocess that content from the correct central location, the correct network drive. Just throw them back into Hive over here as files added from the correct path, reprocess them, and then that will update the record in the future. Hopefully users aren't doing that, and they have a conversation with the users that were doing that. You can know exactly who it was, because this will tell you exactly the usernames that were used to add from their desktop. So as a whole team of people, y'all need to talk to each other and be like, hey, Dave, hey, Sean, hey, Chris, don't do this anymore. Please add from this one location only, okay? But ultimately, with this system, like, you can use this actually as a manager to maintain your content and understand what is the status of all the content. Is it all up to date? Are things out of date? It's up to you, right? Okay. There was a question that I did see show up here about, can you recover older versions of families out of Hive? Now, I will talk about this from the point of view of older versions in Revit versions, not like the 17 different variants of the 2020 that was uploaded. Hive doesn't store that. It only stores the latest edition of each version year. But if maybe you lost something from a previous version year, maybe it was deleted and you want that old edition back, if it's in Hive, you can simply right-click on a piece of content. If this feature is turned on, as a BIM manager, there would be a download option here if it's turned on. In my case, I have allowed downloads turned off because I don't want people downloading stuff directly. But if this feature was turned on and saved and I restarted Hive, I would be able to right-click and download, and Hive would ask me which version year of that content do you want to download, and then I could go recover that 2018 version if I needed to. But you can't recover, say, subversions of content. If you upload a 2020 version and then you make a change and you upload another one, you make another change and upload another one, Hive is not storing 3 different versions of that 2020 content. It only stores the latest file. That's it. It does track the history. You can know when it was updated, but it doesn't store that to roll it back to a previous edition, just so you're aware. Okay, I want to say thank you. And I do look forward to seeing you in future CTC Hive admin learning series. Also, the user learning series is a great one. We look forward to seeing you there. We hope that you'll check out the YouTube channel for all the previous recordings of this series, and share that amongst your team. And so here is my final thank you to you all. Really, we do appreciate when you show up live. It keeps it interesting for us. Hopefully it makes it more interesting and meaningful for you. And we do look forward to seeing you in future CTC webinars. We hope you'll pay attention to our events page so you can get notified about all the new admin learning series coming out, as well as you can leverage this with your end users because we have a user learning series that's partnered with this that tells them how to use Hive as an end user, and you might benefit from that as well. So we hope to see you there, in addition to just the admin series. With that, thank you all. We hope you have a fantastic day, and we look forward to seeing you in the future. We'll catch you all later.